Good morning. This is Kristen, and I wanted to give you guys an update for Chapter 5, which will be studying lipids, which is another name for fats. So there's different types of lipids, and this has to do with their chemical structure. And lipid just basically means that it is not soluble in water. So we have fats, which typically are solid, and then lipids, which are typically oils or liquid. So the very simplest form, kind of the building block of lipids, is fatty acids. So when we learned in chapter 4 in carbohydrates that glucose was the building block of the monosaccharides were the building blocks of carbohydrates, fatty acids are the building blocks for fats. Triglycerides are when this is the form in which we find fat in food and also in our body. And basically a triglyceride is tri means three. So it's three of these fatty acids on a glycerol backbone. So that is the structure. So again, if you think about carbohydrates and we talk about polysaccharides being many glucoses put together, a triglyceride is three fatty acids put together. So when you go and eat food that has fat in it, a hamburger, olive oil, any of those, that you're eating triglycerides. And then our body breaks those triglycerides down into fatty acids and absorbs them. But then when we store fat, we store them in the form of triglyceride. There's also some fats called phospholipids, and these are fats that are found in the brain, especially on the myelin sheaths, and they're also found in most all of the cell membranes. They're also part of fat digestion. Then cholesterol is a little bit different from the fats that we eat because it's chemically a ring-like structure. And cholesterol is found only in animal foods, and cholesterol is a way that our body kind of packages and distributes fat around the body. Okay? So when you eat cholesterol, you're eating foods from animals that had a liver and that packaged that fat and moved it around. So if you look in your book, it'll talk about the different types of fatty acids, and you've probably heard some of these terms before, but the first one is saturated. So saturated fatty acids are the ones that we really want to try to stay away from. These are kind of considered the bad guys, and the reason being is that these tend to increase our blood levels of cholesterol, and that leads us to have increased risk for heart disease. There are two different types of saturated fats, the long chain and the medium chain. And then the mono unsaturated, and I'll show you a picture of these, but mono meaning one, and one place that they're unsaturated. These are the really healthy fats, things like olive oil and avocados and nuts. Then we have poly, which are many places that they're unsaturated, and these are also quite healthy for us. And the two essential fatty acids that we have to have every day come from these polyunsaturated fats. Saturated fats typically come from animal foods, where mono and poly typically come from plant foods. And then the last one is also a bad guy, the trans fatty acids. And these are chemically made from the hydrogenation of oils to make them more solid. And we'll talk about that in this lecture. So, not that you need to memorize this structure, but I wanted to tell you why we call things saturated or unsaturated. So this is an example of a saturated fat. And what this means is that every place on this carbon chain, hydrogens are attached. There are no double bonds on this carbon chain. And so what this means, it's saturated with hydrogens, and thus it's solid at room temperature, and it's a saturated fat. So typically these are foods like butter and lard and beef fat. So things that are solid at room temperature. And there is the saturated fat. Now a mono unsaturated means in one place, mono meaning one, there is a double bond. Okay, so this is an example of this would be like olive oil, canola oil. Then when we move into the poly, it means there are two or more double bonds. Okay, and so this means many places that the carbon chain is not attached with hydrogens. So these give you an example of some of these. This is stearic acid, which is fat in beef. Okay, so this is the chemical structure. This is oleic acid. It's a omega-9 fatty acid, and what this really shows you is that there's one double bond, and we go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. This is the omega end. Remember the acid end? We saw the picture on the last one. The omega end. Omega 9 means that that's the first place there's a double bond. So here's a good one. Oops, let me go back. This is an example of alpha linolenic acid, which is an omega 3 fatty acid. Okay, and so, oh, I think I told you guys the wrong end over here. It's actually, you're right, you start from the end. So it's 1, 2, it's on the third, 1, 2, 3 double bond, omega 3. So this must also be 9. That wasn't a great example. So anyway, keeping in mind that that's how omega 3s are named, it's the first place that the double bond is from the end. Okay. All right, so let's talk about some typical foods that are those types of fatty acids. So everything that we eat is pretty much a combination of all the different fatty acids, because remember there's 3 fatty acids on that glycerol backbone. But typically we call saturated fats things like coconut oil, butter, palm oil, lard, or beef fat. Monounsaturates tend to be olive oil, canola oil, peanut oil, soybean oil. Polys are vegetable oils like safflower and sunflower and corn oil. And then trans fats are margarines, which would typically be made from oil, so they would typically be liquid at room temperature, but they've been hydrogenated to make them solid, and they are more like a saturated fat and thus very high in trans fats. Trans fats, saturated fats are the bad guys. Those tend to raise your blood cholesterol levels, where mono and poly are good guys. So what are the 2 essential fatty acids that we have to have? One of them is an omega 3. That's called alpha linolenic acid. One of the reasons that it's so important is that it helps in our immune function. It also helps our body decrease inflammation. It's found in things like fatty fish, walnuts, flaxseed, canola oil. And then omega 6 fatty acid, linoleic acid. Okay, so those are the 2 essential fatty acids. We would die if we did not get these in our diet. You need less than a teaspoon of fat a day to get both of these. So if you are getting less than a teaspoon of a vegetable fat, you will get both of these. So again, we talked about triglycerides. Remember, those are the form that fat is found in foods. It's also the form that fat is found in our body. It's how we store it. Again, phospholipids contain phosphorus. They're mostly in our cell membrane, but they also participate in fat digestion. We do not have to eat them because our body can actually make what we need. The only thing in fats that we have to eat are those 2 essential fatty acids. And sterols, remember what I told you, sterols was cholesterol. Keep in mind that cholesterol is not an essential, meaning we make plenty of cholesterol every day, and cholesterol is only found in animal foods. So again, cholesterol is produced by the liver, okay? So you have to have a liver to make cholesterol. So that means a little peanut and a little piece of corn can never have cholesterol because they don't have livers. All right, so again, remember, we don't have to eat cholesterol because our body actually makes it. When we eat cholesterol, okay, from animal foods, again, you're eating foods that you're eating something that animal's liver made that cholesterol. Now, how do we affect our blood cholesterol? Saturated fat and trans fats are really what increases the amount of cholesterol that our liver makes through after fat digestion. There are 2 types of cholesterol that our body makes from the fats that we eat. So keep in mind, when we talk about the good cholesterol and the bad cholesterol, you cannot eat these things because these things are not in foods, they're how our body processes fat. These are the desirable cholesterol levels. So HDL means high density lipoprotein, and this is a number that you want to be high. So it's greater than 45 milligrams is the per deciliter is the guideline. LDL is L, you want that to be low, and you want that to be less than 130, and actually the new guidelines are actually showing less than 100 milligrams per deciliter. You probably have heard about blood triglycerides as well. we always have a little bit of fat floating in our blood, especially after we eat. So if you ever go in and get your blood tested, that's one of the reasons that you need to be fasting, is that it gives you a better picture of how much fat is floating in your blood. And we typically want these to be less than 200 milligrams. There are different forms of triglycerides in the body. Again, there was long chain, medium chain, and short chain. And again, when we eat foods that have fat, we are eating them in the triglyceride form. So what foods from the MyPlate have fat? Milk, if you're taking anything other than skim milk doesn't have any fat. Skim and non-fat are the same thing. The meat group clearly does, but beans and legumes don't. Nuts do. And the fat group. Fruits and veggies don't have fat, but keep in mind things like avocados and olives actually go into the fat group. Grains are typically low in fat, and things that are high in sugars may not have fat, but that doesn't mean that you can eat as much of them as you want because they're high in sugars. So again, I think what's interesting about trans fats is the Nobel laureate. So this is a man who won a Nobel Prize who developed the chemistry of hydrogenation. And what he was really looking at has to do with vapors and things like that. But in 1901, this other scientist said, wow, you can take that same concept of hydrogenation and make liquid oils more solid. And what that does is that extends the shelf life. Okay? So you're adding hydrogen to those carbons and making the double bond. Extending the shelf life is huge for food manufacturers. If fat goes rancid in a food, it's not going to taste very good. So most processed foods will use trans fats. And again, the other reason is in frying foods, because trans fats have a higher smoke point, which means that you can cook that product at a higher temperature without it smoking. Okay, so fried foods and packaged foods tends to have trans fats. How much should we have? Actually, we should have none, okay? Because we know that the consumption of trans fats increases the risk of coronary heart disease. And what that does is it actually raises the bad cholesterol, which remember, we want that one to be low, and it actually lowers the good cholesterol. So trans fats do exactly the opposite of what we want them to do in our body. So how much should we have? Well, the National Academy of Sciences says that dietary trans fats are more deleterious with respect to coronary heart disease than saturated fats. So these are the bad guys. And in 2006, the New England Journal of Medicine published a result, and they said from the standpoint, nutritional standpoint, the consumption of trans fats results in potential harm. So, what does that mean? Let me move this up. So the National Academy of Sciences, and I think this is a very interesting statement, has concluded there is no safe level of trans fat consumption. What amazes me about this is how prevalent trans fats still are in our food supply. And this just gives you an example of some of the foods that have trans fats, things like French fries and donuts and cake and shortening and potato chips. Now keep in mind, when you read a label and it says it's trans, if you look at the label and look under trans fats, it may say 0, but it can have 0.6 grams of trans fat in a serving, and it can say that it's still free of trans fats. So if your serving is 10 potato chips and you're eating 30 potato chips, you may be getting a lot more trans fat than you think. So how do we eat less trans fat? Look at your labels. You want to stay away from this word hydrogenated. If a food has hydrogenated oils in it, I wouldn't consume it. Limit how much you deep fry your foods. And if you are deep frying them yourself, it kind of goes back to that Michael Pollan, his 40 food rules or something. And he said, if you want to have junk food, make it yourself, because you're not going to get trans fats if you're using your own oil. Now, shortening is trans fat, so you would need to use a liquid oil. Limit your high-fat baked goods. Baked goods, typically processed baked goods, have trans fats in them. And non-dairy creamers typically have trans fats in them. I'm going to go through the digestion, and then I'll add a part 2 to this based on this lecture's a little bit longer. So on this, I wanted to show you, actually I'll wait to do this on the part 2 lecture.